Good afternoon and welcome to the school. I'm honored to serve as chair of this event. I have to tell you though, I think it's punishment because I delivered a talk last year and they were like, oh, you know social innovation? You can chair it next year. So delighted to offer our second summit, which now is branded as the social. And I love this concept because once we talked to a number of people about what they would want to experience in an event like this, whether you're a budding social entrepreneur, you're a student, you're a faculty member, you're a community member with interest, it was to connect with other people and to talk about your interests and to learn from one another. So that's the character of this week, is it's structured in a way that you get to learn, you get to have a conversation. So tonight we'll have a conversation with the Honorable Jason Green, and then tomorrow and on Wednesday we'll have a range of workshops and other, there's actually a curated networking session tomorrow afternoon. So if you haven't checked out the full agenda, please do and join us for sessions of your choice. I'd like to say a bit about Project Excite and what I think it means to me and DU and the region. This really is an opportunity to think differently about higher education, as the provost said, but it's also an opportunity for us to recognize the assets within Denver and Colorado, a very progressive state that is doing very progressive things in the area of innovation and entrepreneurship. And yet the higher education community has not necessarily been responsive to that or supportive of that. And so in many ways, Excite is working to break down that barrier so that, for example, we are producing a workforce that will stay in the region and be in service to those innovations, that we are serving as a connector, putting different people together to combine their expertise to advance innovation. So I've been delighted to work with this effort. And Greg sort of tipped my hand a little bit because I do have a perspective on this. We've bifurcated the commercial world and the social world, in large measure dictated by the Scottish Enlightenment, but there's too many political scientists in the room, so I'm going to save that in case I get it wrong. But what I do know is that our tax code has really dictated how we think about how we approach the issues in society, and it's been reinforced then through the higher education process, right? We train business folk, we train innovators and entrepreneurs in engineering, and then we train social folks to go out and start nonprofits. It's absurd. We've created silos then where those areas of expertise do not come together, and Excite certainly exemplifies that, where the person, human-centered design, is really at the center of all of this. So I'm excited to be a part of this. It's important to recognize the people who are making it happen. Nina Sharma and Professor Matt Rutherford are the ones really behind all of this, and day in, day out, making it happen. They have an incredible team, and I will tell you, as social work folks, when we were planning this meeting, we would finish a meeting and sort of go, whew. There's nothing like being in a room with some entrepreneurs for fast action. So I appreciate everything that they've done to make this event real. I will say that in my scholarship, I Googled myself last night because I'm working on the workshop for, I actually Googled teaching social innovation, and there were 7 million hits, and I came up 5th and 9th. Now, I'm not saying that to brag. Oh, people are not. This is sort of an accidental place that I found myself. And it's because I'm an impassioned yet critical advocate of how we have approached social innovation, because we've actually taken the commercial processes and just said, well, this is how we do it, when truly the social bottom line is as important as the economic. And so that's been a primary area of my critique. So I didn't really actually answer the question on how you teach this. I just critiqued it. But that really is where the next frontier is, and I think social work has a lot to offer in this way. Social workers themselves actually were the original social innovators, having been founded as a discipline in a field a little over 100 years ago. And when you look at the innovations that we have helped to spur, they're at the forefront. Red Cross, for example. These organizations that at scale are taking their models and working to advance the human condition. Of course, as a dean, this is my bias, but I've been able to identify a few aspects of what I think social work does well in this space that we should embrace as we advance human-centered design. And the first is that we should actually obtain the voices of the people who are going to be impacted by the innovation before we even think we've got an idea, right? And truly embedding ourselves in community and having this be a community-driven process of ideation and innovation. And then the second is we measure the impacts of innovation on people. We actually have 3 courses that the MSW students in the audience are going to say they hate, but I'm telling you, it's going to get you a good job, all right? Making a lot of money, because other people don't do this. It's how do you apply the tools of social science in an evaluative context to assess how people are changed as a result of what you're doing. Good intentions are not enough. We have to hold ourselves accountable in that evaluation. So those are 2 aspects that are really important, and you certainly don't have to be a social worker to do both of those things, and in some ways that's the point of the social. We want to share these skills and expertise. The other piece, though, that is missing from this, and frankly, it's missing often from social work as well, is that if we really want to affect change, it's not ensuring just that we've embedded the design process in the community context, or we've committed to evaluating outcomes, but that we've not removed the innovation from its social, economic, and political context. So there's a lot of discussion about scaling innovation. You can't scale innovation unless you integrate policy into that equation. And yet we have a United States where 10 years ago, all 50 states, you had to pass a civics test to graduate. And today it's 25 states. So we're actually generating a crop of people who don't know the policy process and what those levers are and how you could put an idea that's been community grounded into that larger kind of context. And that's one of the main reasons we have Jason Green with us here today. He knows all of those elements. Our format's one of conversation. Jason didn't want to just give a lecture, even though he could. He'll talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a little bit of coffee talk. I feel like we should do Ellen DeGeneres up to the stage or something when we finally get to that, right? You're game, he's game. And then we'll certainly open it up to all of you. I have to tell you, I've known Jason for some time. I was at Washington University in St. Louis for 23 years, and he's a graduate of that fine institution. He's an entrepreneur, he's a lawyer, he's a political strategist, and he spent his career empowering individuals and communities. And hopefully he'll say a bit about his family and community roots, which I think are big drivers for him in this area. He's co-founded and serves as vice president and general counsel of SkillSmart, which is a software company enabling job seekers to reach their employment potential. And his work in the White House actually informed this process. He's actually a serial entrepreneur, and I hope he'll address some of the work that he did when he was getting his law degree at Yale. He's also working on a documentary right now about his family and this historic community of Quince Orchard, Maryland, and how they came together as a very diverse community. I think that's probably more needed now than ever, and he wants to inform that larger social discussion. So, yep, you heard me. I said White House. So Jason's responsible for actually helping get President Obama elected, and then he said, hey, will you give me a job? So he served 4 years in the White House as special counselor around domestic policy and has been a champion for the people, not just then, but throughout his lifetime. We're so lucky to have him here today. Please join me in welcoming Jason Green.
Thank you. I tried to cut that short. You talked a little bit about the campaign. So in 2008, did anybody come to an Obama campaign rally? Did you guys go to one of those 1,000-person events? We made you get there 4 hours early. You weren't particularly happy with me. I apologize. Well, in Connecticut, I was the National Voter Registration Director, as Amanda mentioned, but I also worked in a number of states. Nevada, Connecticut, Maryland, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Texas. When we were in Connecticut, right before February 5th, we decided to have one of those big rallies at the Excel Center, seated about 17,000 people. Day before the election, people got there hours early, just like all of you, And they waited. And they waited, an hour went by, 2 hours went by, 3 hours went by. Well, the senator finally gets into the building, and you know, because this music starts to come on, there's a little bit more energy in the room, and we're backstage. And so it's finally time. They pushed me out, you know, from behind the curtains. I had to go out and introduce Senator Obama. And so here you got 17,000 people in the center, and I come out and jog up the stairs, and walk to the podium. And these people are really excited. They're really going loud and hard, and I realize that they think I'm Barack Obama. And so I do exactly what I wave to the right? I wave to the left, and I say, I am not Barack Obama. And I've never seen so many people so quickly disappointed. I earned the name Fobama that day. But thank you for clapping for me. I appreciate that. That's very generous of you. And thank you for having me. I appreciate the dean, the provost, Nina, and the rest of the Project Excite team. It's very exciting what you guys are doing here. That cross-collaboration of institution is paramount, critical, and so needed right now. We heard a little bit about some of the things that I've done, but for me, it's all about sort of what's at your core constitution. So to hear what the social is, what it's intended to be, I think it's important that you hear sort of who I am and what I try and do and orient myself. So I go all the way back to the roots that Dean McBride mentioned, my family, incredibly close to me. And you know, it started when I was young. I didn't always appreciate that closeness. I grew up on a street that my parents lived at the bottom of and my grandmother lived at the top of. So it was hard to get away with anything. The beatings were just, you know, they got worse as you went down the street. But it was important to have family around, or a community of people who knew who I was and whose I was and were willing to look out for me. I have had some okay successes in life, but I look back to when I was 15 and 16 years old, and things were going outwardly well and inwardly not so well. And this was the joy of having a bit of a hovering father who happened to be a minister and a community organizer and counselor in his own right. And so we had many conversations as I was struggling to find my own value, as I was trying to figure out what my worth was and who might miss me if I wasn't around. I had a doting dad who would, you know, constantly check in as he saw some of those dark clouds for me. And it's unfair to summarize that experience in just a phrase. There are a lot of conversations that I was really fortunate to be able to have with someone like him. But what sticks with me and what I wrote down on a cue card and what sits on top of my desk is this phrase. He told me once that perfection is unobtainable, but it's the quest for it that makes life worth living. Perfection is unobtainable, but it's the quest for it that makes life worth living. In the first sentence, he freed me from my obsession about perfection, right? Newsflash, we are all imperfect. Newsflash, we are all imperfect, and hopefully someone's out there, you felt a little bit of sigh and a little bit of relief that you don't always have to be perfect. But the second sentence, I think, is what's critically important to that sentence, and that it is the quest for perfection that makes life worth living. And so the recognition that I as an individual and we as individuals were made perfectly imperfect, but that we still have an opportunity and a responsibility to make this world in which we've been born more perfect. And that's my calling, to try where I can to make this world more perfect. It's the way in which the way in which I innovate. It's the way in which I look at people. It's the way in which I look at myself. Is how have I met my mission today to try and make our world a little bit more perfect? And frankly, we need a little bit more perfection today. I don't want to get too political. You know my background. I spent a lot of time with President Obama. I served for 4 years under him. And so, in part as an ethics counsel, so I'm particularly outraged. But we saw some challenging things last November. And this isn't partisan. We can talk about the immigration debates. We can talk about healthcare policy. We can debate those policy issues. But we saw something more profound and frankly much uglier. And that is questions about who we are as a people and as a country, and who belongs in that conversation and in that discussion. And I think that's where, in its frustration, is also in its opportunity. That's why you're calling to think about things bigger than yourselves. Your interest in understanding not just the institution, but how the institution affects the person. Why that's so critically important right now. One of the stories that's moved me to action, my grandmother. My grandmother's actually the reason I left the White House. She was 95 years old, and she was ill. She's the reason I went into public service in the first place. When I was a 5-year-old kid, I would get dropped off before school at my grandmother's house. And after kindergarten, that's where I was left until my parents got home from work. And because my grandmother volunteered at the nursing home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at the nursing home on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My job was to go scoop ice. So I'd go find my ice bucket and the big bucket down at the big ice machine down at the end of the hallway. And after I'd get my ice and I'd come back, my grandmother would be giving a gift of dignity to someone late in life. She always knew whether it was to sit silently or to talk loudly, to offer an ice chip or a daily devotional. She was giving that gift, and I saw that you could influence someone's life just by being present. So that's what I wanted to do. Well, at 95, she wasn't doing so well, and ironically enough, she was in that very nursing home that she had taken me when I was a child. And I had talked about writing her story for years. She's a fascinating woman, and I hadn't done anything. And so when I got the call from my sister, who's our family physician, we keep it close. My dad's our minister, it works out well. When I got that call from my sister that grandma probably wasn't going to come home, I knew it was time. And so I asked the White House for a 2-month leave, and I went and I sat at her bedside. And I asked her all the questions that she didn't want to answer. Who's the first person you kissed? You know, I wanted that juicy, the juicy goodness, and she wanted to talk a little bit more about where she was from. And she told me about the schoolhouse that she went to as a girl. This is the schoolhouse in Quince Orchard that Amanda mentioned. This is the former colored schoolhouse, built in 1868, and she started attending in 1924. Quick aside, I thought that I had gotten there too late. I thought that her mind, had started to fade. She was 95, right? She used to be so sharp. And I remember I asked her, when did you start going there? And she goes, and I'm like, oh no, I waited too long. And she goes, I think it was a Thursday. I was like, here we go. And she started. And so she talked about attending this school. And beyond just her attending, she talked about the fact that my great-great-grandfather was one of the men that built the school in 1868, 3 years after the end of slavery. And as she was telling me about this, I found it very hard to take. I've seen the building, this one-room schoolhouse, White House, right on the main drag, and I had to question, surely there had to be a less conspicuous way. They had to be worried about whether this was safe. And as I'm sort of doing my analysis, my grandmother stops me. She stops me short, and she says, the black children in the community needed a school. There was no public education for African Americans. Your great-great-grandfather and those other men looked around their community and they saw a need. They were doers, and doers do. It was the most simple yet profound statement I'd ever heard, and here I was, confounded by my paralysis of analysis. How could they put it there? Here. There was a need in the community. They saw that need. They were doers, and doers do. You'll see I wear my doers shirt, and this is not a versus. This is not dreamers versus doers. This is we've dreamt. Now we do. And it's cyclical. Continue to dream and then take action. It's fundamentally important to the work that we do, to the world that we need to create, that we all take action. As Amanda mentioned, I don't want to stand up here and give a long lecture. My voice won't allow it. But before we transition into the coffee talk portion of the evening, I'd be remiss if I didn't share one White House story. So it's an interesting place to work, as Aaron can tell you, wherever you are, as Aaron can tell you from our White House days. It's a place where you have to grow up really fast. regardless of your age. You're growing up and you're thrown into the deep water, and it's something I didn't fully understand. So one of our first days in the building, we had a meeting in the situation room. So you go to the situation room, which effectively is just a conference room. A really cool, high-tech conference room. So you walk in, and you're obviously, there's some intimidation that happens, but you're there. It's a staff meeting. You're there. You work there. When you walk in, there's a big conference room. And there are chairs around that conference room table. And then around the wall, there's another set of chairs. Okay, so if you can imagine a big conference room table in the middle, chairs around that table, and then another set of chairs outlining the walls. And as I walked in, I slid into one of the chairs by the wall, as many of my colleagues did. And the boss was a little late that day, but when he came in, he took his position and looked around and saw so many empty seats around the table and looked at us all as if to say, who are you waiting for? Who are you waiting for? Because we have work to do. Take your seat at the table. We have work to do. And that concept has stuck with me, is that you can't keep looking over your shoulder for someone else to take the responsibilities that you need to take, nor can you just take your seat at the table. I think so often when I was there, I thought about the fact that I was the only black male lawyer, I was the youngest lawyer, and so often that made me not want to say anything. But if you think about it, that's the reason that I have to say something, because who else carries your perspective but you? You have a PhD in you, and that perspective is so important for us if you fundamentally believe in the mission of the social, which I do, and that is we are in this together and we are benefited by each of us giving our best so that we can each reach our best. And man, you gotta take that seat at the table, because we sure have a lot of work to do. How about we transition? Does that work? Thank you. Dun, dun, dun. Should I move this? Can you guys see?
So Jason's, he's smart with heart. He's got a lot to share with us today. I want to now transition into really asking him to drill down on his entrepreneurial experiences. And in particular, he has SkillSmart, which he started most recently, but when he was at Yale Law School, he also started a community development bank, and he worked on foreign investment strategy, compliance around that strategy. So he is a serial entrepreneur, and I think people would benefit, given that we frame this as, we got to do better in this arena, to know the issues so that we develop ventures that actually make a difference and then assess those differences. Give us some sense about where these ventures came from and why you got involved in them.
I think it starts with each of us require a fundamental belief that we can actually influence the outcomes. You have to actually believe that when you see a problem, you can play a role, whether it be big or small, in the outcome of that initiative. So you talk about serial entrepreneurship. My first company was when I was 6 years old. So I didn't know I was starting a company, but when I would go around the neighborhood with my best friend, we would we'd see streams, and we would see lakes, and we would see that there was always trash or aluminum cans, and so we started picking them up. We thought that it was a good thing to do. I'd come home, I'd take all the cans that we had collected, I'd give it to my mom would go to the recycling, she'd come back with money, and this is an incredible, give her her cut, keep her on the payroll. And so fundamental to that core was the idea that we have a responsibility and the ability to actually do something. I think to a point that you made earlier, we often silo these things away, the concept of commercial, policy, nonprofit, and I fundamentally disagree with that concept. I think one of the most destructive things, or at least unfair things that we do to young people, is ask them at a very young age, what do you want to do when you grow up? Or excuse me, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would be much happier if that conversation could be, who do you want to be? What do you want to do? Because we get in this very narrow concept where outcomes transcend those verticals. If you want to empower individuals in community, you can do that as a police officer, you can do that as an art curator, you can do that as a documentarian. So I think that we, as a society, sort of put people in these buckets of what their outcomes can be. And so we need to break that down and then fundamentally suggest that everybody has the ability and the power to affect social change.
Walk us through SkillSmart from sitting around that conference room and seeing some of the data and interacting with the people affected to then generating a multidisciplinary team and moving toward capitalization of the venture. How'd you do
I will try
it?
not to wonk out too much on skills. I will go deep. If you guys want to go deep on skills, we can talk about it later. SkillSmart is the evolution of a policy experience I had at the White House. It is both a technology and a consultancy, and I will, my very short bit about it is that it's trying to help individuals understand that you're more than a resume. You're a collection of unique experiences and skill sets that can qualify you for different employment opportunities at its core. I had a conversation with my mother. She asked me to look at her resume. This was, for employers watching, this was a long time ago. I wouldn't worry about it. But she asked me to look at her resume. And so I looked at it, and I saw what any individual who looks at resumes would flag, that she had some gaps in her professional history. Of course, she reminded me that she came out of the workforce to take care of some really annoying kids, right? For which I'm eternally grateful. What was unfortunate about that experience wasn't that she, had some gaps on her resume. It's that she didn't think that her experiences as a stay-at-home mom equated into the workforce. The skill sets that I saw her demonstrate and perfect every day that I know employers want, she didn't think were particularly valued and couldn't think about how to actually convey that information in a meaningful way because it doesn't really capture on a resume. It's those sorts of experiences I was seeing when military vets who had engaged in incredibly high-level work couldn't come back and transfer those military experiences into the civilian workforce. Individuals who are nearing the end of their work age, who need to retire but couldn't stop working, had definable skill sets but couldn't think about how to transfer that. It's people that, my old colleagues, I was talking to the provost about this. When you work in politics, you have titles like the Deputy Director of Special Projects to the Assistant Secretary for the Task Force. What does that mean? No one knows. And so individuals weren't able to convey into the business world or the academic world what those concepts were unless you break it down more into, well, what did you do? What are your competencies and what are your skill sets? And so I said this was going to be short, right? So at its core, that's what SkillSmart is intended to do, to help provide a baseline of vocabulary and orientation that allows individuals to convey their skill sets regardless of where they got them, to democratize the way in which we get jobs, and to allow people to bring their unique experience, whether a skill set was developed in an academic setting or without, whether it was in a formal work setting or an informal one, for us as a society to say that we give those experiences equal value and then provide clear pathways to opportunity.
How are you measuring outcomes?
So this is the beauty of social venture. When people ask why this was the only thing that you wanted to do and how did you know that, that's not true. I had a strike zone. I knew that I wanted a technology. I wanted to have a project that had the power to have systemic and transformational change I'm a systems guy, to systems that I thought were inefficient. And I also wanted there to be financial opportunity. And I think it's really important that we talk about that we get paid for our work. And I wanted to have a technology in part because it allows for valuations to scale, and that's really significant to what I want to do for the continuance of my community and my family. And so we measure impacts on the social side by individuals that get hired. We're measuring the amount of social services that are not being deployed, the costs that do not have to be deployed because individuals are now working. So we're transitioning individuals from areas of poverty to post-poverty. We're tracking the number of individuals that go to training. So the piece that I didn't talk about in the explanation is now on this system, you're understanding what a job is, right? You're seeing its component skill sets, but you're also seeing how well qualified you are for those opportunities based upon your breadth of background. But there will be gaps, right? And as we continue to disaggregate jobs and disaggregate education, the question becomes, how do you get what you need? And so the last piece of our platform is, if you don't have all the skill sets that you need, we connect you to the content that delivers those skill sets. So we break down content into skills outcomes to track individuals that are continue to engage in their skills development.
What are some of the disciplines represented on the team?
Talk to me more.
So when you think about all the people in the different positions necessary to make it happen, so the technology, the measuring, the rollout.
I was like, they're all very disciplined.
I'm talking like an academic.
Absolutely. So, it's really fascinating. I am not the technologist, nor am I the content matter expert. So my business partner and I get to try and set out a vision, and we both experienced this. I experienced it from the policy side. Employers were coming into the White House frustrated that they couldn't find skilled talent, but at the same time couldn't articulate what a skilled individual looked like. They would say, give me somebody with a 4-year degree or 5 years of work experience. But we would say, but you said you couldn't find someone with the right skills. What are those skills? And they would say, like I said, give me somebody with a 4-year degree. And so there was that disconnect. My business partner comes from the community college background. He still serves as the chair of our local community college back in Maryland. So we had to go out and get subject matter expertise, both on the development side. We have engineers, so we have a team of engineers, but where I really get excited about the potential for our product is in our skills curation team. So these are individuals that spend, this is where I said I will wonk out on skills. They spend their days building out our skills taxonomy that we built from scratch that defines all these discrete atomic skills. And then they also measure what sort of engagement, what sort of utilization of those skills is required to reach a different level of proficiency. So if you use this skill every day, how proficient would you be? That allows our system to run, so now you can tell me that you had an experience that lasted 2 weeks, and you did something every day, and it fits into our model. So every experience is valued, not valued equally, but every experience is valued. So we have subject matter experts then that go into each of our different verticals. So we do work in hospitality, retail, logistics, cybersecurity, informatics. This concept of skills-based hiring is now cross-cutting, and so we employ and engage with experts in each of those industries. That's on the content expertise. We think that just as important as the technology and what's is built into the technology is how that technology is deployed. So our team is then, the other half of our team are community engagement specialists who are doing client management, but are also every community is different, right? So we deploy this technology to be an ecosystem for a community to pipeline talent into jobs and into training programs. But in some communities, that's an employer-led effort. In some communities, that's an academically led effort, a nonprofit, the Chamber of Commerce. And so our staff needs to be capable and able of having those conversations both with the elected officials in that community as well as the business sector, nonprofit sector. I was talking to someone earlier that the SkillSmart is effectively a technology and a consultancy put together. And so we need people with each of those skill sets.
I have to pause as the academic who asked the academic question. How critical what he just said is. It blows up this notion of the hero entrepreneur who parachutes in and has the great idea and is always out front. It's really about the team, and that so many different parts have to come together to make this work. I think in many ways what you just described is the best practice. I'd love for you to come up, 20,000 feet. So when you started, right, like the day before the inauguration. So you were really there from the beginning. And President Obama had a vision around innovation, around social innovation. He founded the White House Office on Social Innovation. I believe Sona Shaw was who's now at Georgetown leading their Social Innovation Center. Tell me about what you think the movement is doing well and where it could improve.
When we talk about the startups, I think my favorite startup was the White House. Just candidly, so you talk about starting there the day before. Talk about the company, I talk about being 6 years old. We don't often talk about that as just as a startup. So when we got there was no technology. We had gateway computers with the still connected to their keyboards, and we didn't have the ability to leave with work. We didn't have laptops. We didn't have BlackBerries yet. Our email didn't work. And so for the first couple of weeks, you really couldn't leave. And there's this weird law, thanks to Richard Nixon, called the Presidential Records Act, that doesn't allow, all the records of the presidency are preserved and maintained, but at the end of an administration, they leave. So day one, it's actually, we should talk about this as a country, that's probably not the best way to operate, but January 20th, they're gone, they're at the library. And so the new political group that's coming into the White House doesn't have the benefit of any of that last 4 or 8 years of experience. And so we couldn't leave because our technology wouldn't allow it. And then every question that we got as a lawyer, we had to literally research the entirety of the issue. So you get a very simple question like, can I hire a dual citizen? And you would say, that's a good question. When do you need an answer to that? Oh, today? Okay, well, let me go figure out the entire history of dual citizen hiring in the United States. So it was a very interesting startup, probably one of the most fascinating places to be. On the social innovation side, I think what's exciting about the movement is how we are breaking down barriers. I mean, this is a cross-cutting issue. An organization we didn't talk about that I helped start is the Arena. If any of you have heard about the Arena, its mission, and we're piggybacking on the Teddy Roosevelt quote about those that can be judged or those that are actually in the arena. And this is trying to take this idea of ideation and entrepreneurship into the political space and trying to encourage people to actually run for office. And I try and deliver this speech very often to social workers because I think we would all be bettered if we had more social workers running for office. And I'm now doing a boot camp for social workers to run for office, so please run for office. But it's also taking this idea outside of just the running for office space and helping individuals build organizations with social impact and providing that support. So in the political context, if you think about swipe left or run for something, or how do you use the power and precision of technology to target state legislature races that are like Flippable is doing. So those sorts of organizations. I think that's where we're taking these concepts. You talk about design thinking, solution-driven orientation, taking them out of the academy in some instances, trying to make this concept a little bit more practical. And I think that that's where I would probably put the challenge. I mean, it's not surprising that I want practical solutions. I think it's really important that the policy paper be written, but I think it's just as important that someone know how to take that policy paper and put it into practice, and then let that practice actually affect some element of social change. So I think that's where the sort of future. And that, I think this is, now you brought it to President Obama, I think that's what he wants to do with the Obama Foundation. Is to really inspire a community of change makers and activists to take these concepts and employ them. I think if there's a clear outcome from the last political cycle, it's that this is going into the community. So often the focus has been the policy conversation and the political power conversation has been about Washington, D.C. I think that you'll see that has changed. You see a lot more focus at the congressional level, a lot more focus at the state legislative level on the political side, as well as these concepts can now be put into place at the local level.
We want to have time for you all to ask questions and reflections, and they can't all be about President Obama, okay? Hey, while they're thinking of their question, I want to know when you're running for office.
See, the thing is, you start a political organization that helps other people run for office, so you don't have to answer that question. Be the change, guys. Be the change. Just be it.
So open it up to you all. Yeah, great.
Well, I was just thinking about what you said about how the action is sort of moving out locally, and we've seen some examples of that with some decisions the current president has made, like with
we're going to do it anyway.
You know, which was very exciting to me that people just decided to take it into their own hands. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about like what you think that means for the system, you know, sort of over the long haul.
Absolutely. I think the word that you've heard a lot out of our mouths is the word community. I think that you've seen a real globalization movement. That's probably, I would say that's the term of the last decade or last movement period. I would say community is probably going to be the term of this period, where people are, I think one of the things that has come out of this election is a question of why wait and why not me and why not here. So it sort of has forced us to look at each other as the solution, because we can't rely necessarily on Washington, D.C. to be the solution. And so I don't think that that's going to, I think that's really powerful. I think we have ceded too much to to others. I'll just say it that way. We, again, this goes back to the first thing that I said, have to have a fundamental belief in our ability to improve, change, affect an outcome. The documentary is about, I talked about my grandmother and the doers do component there, but the longer narrative arc of the film is about 3 racially segregated churches that were all built out of the Civil War. There was one African-American church, these were all Methodist, all in a rural community. There was one African-American church. There were 2 white churches, but one was northern and one was southern, right? Of course, we got to find a way to divide. But so you had those 3 rural community churches in a town of a couple hundred. So it's amazing to me that there were 3 churches even to begin with. 100 years later, these 3 churches are faced with financial hardship. They can't make it on their own. So one night, the African-American church, decides to have a meeting. And they gather in that 100-year-old schoolhouse in 1968. Everyone's there. And there's a real debate going on between this young population that's just gone through school desegregation and an older population who is saying that school desegregation was the right thing, but we can't merge with these other churches because you don't understand the significance of the black church. You don't understand what was sacrificed so that we could have this. And I don't know what my personal status would be in that merged institution. As that very practical debate is going on, the proverbial knock comes at the door. There's the minister who's been sitting in the parking lot listening to the radio, and he delivers the news that King has just been assassinated. Right, so this meeting's taking place on April 4th, 1968. Well, that meeting goes off the rails. There's tears, there's anger. My dad was 17 years old, and so he remembers being in that room. And what he remembers is the pastor giving a prayer. Everyone joined their hands, and he prayed for the King family, he prayed for the country, but he prayed for courage. And he thought that was precarious. 2 weeks later, that group reconvenes, and they hold the vote that they were supposed to hold 2 weeks before. And those that weren't sure about this concept were no more sure, but somehow they voted, and they voted to merge that congregation. They took that then to those 2 other congregations, and they accepted. So those 3 congregations had their last segregated service in September of 1968, and for the last 50 years have been a purposely integrated congregation. What moves me about that story isn't just that they merged, but it's that these churches didn't merge. People in 3 churches merged. They didn't wait for the conference to tell them to do it. They didn't wait for the party to tell them to do it. They didn't wait for the state to do it. Those people decided that they were going to do something different. And so I think to your point about what does that mean, I think it's just a call for good old-fashioned community organizing and a fundamental belief that you can affect that outcome. And how would they know that 50 years later, that story, its history would continue to motivate, that they would have made it that long? They couldn't have, but it was worth doing. And it's certainly, if you take that to the broader context, an issue that we should be willing to fight for.
JB.
This is really a question for both of you. Just talk a little bit about capital, particularly social capital. Yeah. Where are we on that journey? You want to go first? I'm happy to jump. Oh, yeah.
I think within within the social innovation space, we've been so focused on the idea and where we might stand in relative position to others that we haven't focused on the networking. It's like networking is still a dirty word. And frankly, you're one of the best ones in town, JB. I mean, it's really owning that the only way we're going to get through this is if we connect to one another, and it means being humble. It means taking risk. It means, sharing your idea with others and allowing them to poke holes in it and then rebuild it back up with you. And I think that it's the hubris that's built into the entrepreneurship movement that needs to be broken down so we actually can develop more social capital. And then frankly, it's the hustle. You got to show up. It's like anything you want done in DC, you got to show up. You can't just call from your community. So I think there's an element of breaking that down and being willing to be vulnerable.
I totally agree. I think that on the capital side, too often the conversation is about getting to that billion-dollar valuation. We need more businesses. We need businesses, whether you call them social ventures or not, but we need businesses that are rooted in the community, whose outcomes are aligned with those community outcomes. When I talk about sort of the shift to globalization, you can see this in the banking space, where you had large banks. You used to have a lot of community development banks. We talked about this, did some work in New Haven. And then you saw that then become more and more conglomeratized. Well, then now they're shifting back to say, we've got a bank branch in your neck of the woods. I mean, I think what you really want to see are more businesses that are starting that may or may not ever touch venture capital dollars. I mean, we don't really talk about small business lending, the SBA. It's not good enough, generally speaking. I think the impact numbers that people are looking for are unrealistic often, and that's a challenge. We're talking about access to capital where valuations are just ridiculous, and so ideas that are really furthering the community may be overlooked for an idea that will entertain a generation of people, but may actually have no social good. And so I think that this concept of what a business needs to be, and even what a technology business needs to be, is too focused on what's happening in Silicon Valley and not focused enough on the problems and the solutions that need to be happening in communities, because there are a host of businesses that would do very well and make for a good living that will never reach a billion-dollar valuation.
Let's go to this corner. Jennifer.
Hi there. I am a PhD student here at the Graduate School of Social Work. I'm very interested in the future of machine learning and AI, robotics, automation, and what that means for the future of jobs and the labor market. I know there have been a lot of very different opinions about this as of late, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, given your business, what you think the essential skill sets will be for the future, and what you think this means for the future of socially focused professions.
Yeah, it's an interesting space, particularly because there's such differing views about what the impacts are going to be on the job market from AI. And you see it practically, just the move into the sharing economy, but then also knowing that sharing economy is going to pivot. You think about Lyft and Uber drivers and what percentage of cars on the road right now are engaged in some sort of ride sharing, but then to think that that's going to be an automated process. The way I think about it is from a systems level. So I can't predict what those jobs are going to be. I'll read those reports and see the differing perspectives like others. What I want to see us do is invest in a system that can be dynamic and nimble and responsive as we see those different types of work changing. I think we can all agree that there will be skill sets that are needed. I think we can all agree that there will be the ability to train on those skill sets. And fundamentally, because of the way in which we're going with the disaggregation of everything, that there needs to be clarity and transparency around how you get there. What I mean by that is, let's understand what the end goal is, even though it's going to change. The job today, the job tomorrow, the pieces of that job, you may not have, a traditional 8-hour, and even now we don't have a traditional. So what are the component pieces of that, and how do we articulate that more clearly? That clarity of articulation also allows for our clarity of evaluation. So now how do you engage with those skill sets? Where do you get them? And then education is only becoming more important. Even though I talk about the disaggregation of it, we're seeing that jobs more and more requiring some element of post-secondary training. So what does that look like? I think that in the future, some people say that, you know, some people aren't meant for college and some people are. I disagree with that statement. I think we're all prepared for some post-secondary training. It may not be a 4-year experience away from home, you know, in the sort of traditional setting that I'm familiar with. But what we need are more models that are delivering quality content that makes it clear for an individual where that actually plugs into the broader system. I think too often it's masked. It's not clear what this is going to get me. So if we can increase the efficacy of that system and move people along through the process. So it's like, let's invest in a system that works and become responsive to whatever we end up doing.
Second row, you get the last question. Yeah, you.
Yeah, I think that there's both the opportunity to innovate through technology and through systems innovation. I think one of the things that we're seeing we haven't done a lot of over the last 20, 30 years is practical learning in academic settings. And, you know,
It is
you
true.
can say it. And so that in and of itself is actually sort of, people are innovating on that model. How do you bring that workplace learning into an academic setting? We're talking a lot about the apprenticeship model. You're hearing a lot about the German model. I think that there's a lot of room for people to develop those skill sets here. This is intended to be the sandbox for you to learn and mess up. I think that's the important part that we've heard already about ideation and agile learning and development, is that you get the opportunity to practice on a real world challenge and get it wrong in a space that's safe and be really comfortable. And that's not just meaning that it's safe to do it here. I think it's an important skill to learn. If you're not willing to engage at that table in the conference room because you fear that your perspective is wrong, well, then your voice never gets heard. And so I think that that's part of the process. So I think then there's also just a bunch of technology that's being innovated around the academy right now, both to ensure that people are actually matriculating in a smart way, are actually finishing. Our new financing models are starting to pop up. So between the K-12 and the post-secondary space, there used to be a focus on dollars going into the K-12 innovation space. I see that shifting much more into the post-secondary, adult learning, workforce development is going to see a lot of attention.
Let's line up for those dollars. Jason, why don't you end? We have a number of students in the audience, a number of faculty themselves who are trying to be more innovative in a range of things that they're working on. What advice do you have to them as they embark on a life as an innovator?
Listen to a lot of podcasts. No, it's important. I watch a lot of TED Talks. No, I think that to this point, we've talked about it a little bit, and I think that this story will convey my point. The president on the campaign trail, he would say, one voice. You guys remember this? He would say, one voice can change a room, and one room can change a city, and one city can change a town, and one city can change a state, and one state can change a country, one country can change the world. And what I always found fascinating is that because he was the candidate and he was the one at the front of the room, everyone always thought that he was talking about himself. And he wasn't. He was talking about each of our individual opportunity, and I would argue responsibility, to be that voice that's in the room. It's the same. I mean, that's not just a room like this. That's a room when you're amongst your peers and amongst your family and amongst your colleagues, to be that innovator and the agitator. I really want people to see that that is your responsibility to create opportunities and systems and outcomes that are designed to shape your community, shape individuals, and consequently change the world. I'll leave with that.
I so appreciate how you've put the onus on all of us to think differently about our role in society and our responsibility. You've been inspirational. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you guys so much for having me.